Ladies and gentlemen and assembled company, welcome to the first event of today at the World Storytelling Cafe at the 2025 Marrakesh International Storytelling Festival. And I am honoured to present the twins. They will be introduced by Tahir Shah, and he will explain why the whole family is so important to this and many other projects around it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, John. And hey, what a delight. It's fabulous to be here. So I'm Tahir Shah, some of you know that already, others don't. Before I start, I want to start this way. I live in Morocco, I live in Casablanca, and Marrakechis, people in Marrakesh here, don't really like Casablanca, but for all kinds of reasons. But I drove down here a couple of days ago, and I want you all to remember something. You probably came by flight, but I drove. Okay, I should have walked or crawled on my knees to appreciate where we are. We are deep in the desert. This is not, okay, it's a city, but it is a city in the desert. Okay, this sounds tacky and crazy, but I'm going to run with it. Can we all just close our eyes for like 10 seconds and think where we are? We're in the desert. We're in crazy, bustling, rustling Marrakesh. But this was an ancient caravanserai of camels and fonduks and palm trees and storytellers. Like thousands of years ago, the seed of this great metropolis fell not far from where we're sitting now I like to think in Jamal Fna, and the city grew and grew just like something from Alf Layla wa Layla, the 1001 Nights, just like a story, like the story of, you know it, Maruf the Cobbler. I've got goosebumps telling you this because the fact that I'm in Morocco is no coincidence. I'm in Morocco because I'm so in awe of this culture and the mindsets and the way that facts and fantasy are blurred together in the most extraordinary alchemy and hybrid of life, the universe, and everything. And really, that's the most wonderful thing to me. And the fact that we are all here today and other people joining online, it's because there's something about Morocco. It's not a normal, ordinary country. It's not Europe. It's not the Americas. It's not the rest of Africa or Australia or Latin America. It's its own thing. Morocco is this extraordinary mixture. To me, it is an alchemy, and this is the crucible. And we're just incredibly, incredibly fortunate to be here and now and be part of it. And it sounds nuts, but I've lived here a lot of the time over the last 20 or so years. And I go on and on about it all the time. And I've written a few books about Morocco. I wrote this one called In Arabian Nights, which is about stories. It's called Morocco Through Stories. And I've written other stuff about Morocco, and what I've tried to do is show how folklore and how stories have shaped normality here. And it is the most magical, absurd, glorious normality that I'm hoping with time everyone else will take on to. I know some countries like Germany, it's going to take longer than others because not knocking them, but they have a longer, the United States maybe, but they have a longer, more glorious journey ahead of them. In our family, stories are more important than anything else. And as John said, my father, my twin sister is here. So our dad was a writer called Idris Shah. And he was very, very preoccupied with stories and so-called teaching stories, stories that contain wisdom and ideas and information that can be used as a kind of what he would call an instruction manual to the world. And his sister, our aunt, Amina Shah, we grew up with her and our father and others telling stories. From the moment we woke up in the morning, people would tell stories. They would tell stories about kings and queens and dragons and jinn and magical monsters and ifrit. And they would even tell stories about stories. And this was our normality. And later it was strange for us to go out into the world and realize that some countries didn't have this this bedrock, or they did, but the people had forgotten that it existed. And I'm going to come to that in a moment. I'm just going to ramble on for a few minutes, and then I'm going to invite a couple of my buddies who happen to be there and there to join me. But in our family, there's a tradition, and the tradition is that when there's more than a handful of people together, it's good practice and good manners to begin with a story. And although some of the stories told by our family are as long as entire books or longer, I'll begin with a short one. And it's a story that goes around my head most of the time. And it's a story about a little stream. Once upon a time, long, long ago, in a very far off land, which probably wasn't very far from here, actually, because it was definitely Morocco. And it was definitely in the Atlas Mountains, in this version anyway. A tiny, tiny little source of water bubbled up out of the ground. And as the first droplets gushed out of top of a little mountain, the little water source thought to itself, oh my gosh, this is amazing. The sun, there's everything. And I've been in the ground for so long. And what is this? There's air, there's light. I can breathe. I was in the ground. And the source of water went down the mountainside, a tiny trickle. And as more and more of it came out of the ground, got a little bit bigger, and got more and more enthusiastic and excited, came down as a tiny stream from the top of the Atlas Mountains, down, 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 getting bigger and bigger, and it went between boulders and cacti, and it passed villages, still quite a small stream. And eventually it reached the plain. And as it reached the plain, the desert plain, it was rejoicing. My gosh, just nothing can hold me back. I will reach the ocean, it was saying, far, far away. But suddenly, as it reached the plain, the desert plain, its water, its droplets began to be sucked down into the desert sands. And the little stream was going, oh no, what's happening? What's happening? I want to go back into the ground. I want to get to the ground. So long. What am I going to do? And then it heard a voice, and the voice was an old wise voice. And the old wise voice said, I know what you are. You're a stupid little stream. You were in the ground, then you came up through the mountain, you come down the mountain, you reach the desert, and you're going to be sucked down, like it or not, unless you change your form. And the desert said, think, little stupid, little young stream, think back to another time when you were something else, when you were not just a young stream. And the stream said, I'm a little stream, I just came out of the ground, I can't do the boat. Here I am, I don't want to go back to the desert. That's the stream voice.
That's a very high voice.
The stream was young and high voice. And suddenly the stream did think back. Thought and it thought and it thought and it thought. It remembered that at another time there was another time when it had been something else. And it remembered and it remembered and it remembered. And The desert again said, little stream, you must change your form. It said, if you remember, you've crossed me many, many times before. You and your ancestors have crossed me, little stream, and you've been the river before, and you've been the ocean before. You can cross me again, but you will have to change your form. And so the little stream did something very clever. It allowed itself, its waters, its droplets, to be sucked up into the wind and to be blown across the desert sands, and then to gather on a mountainside far away and become a stream again. That's a story that my sister knows, my friend Jason knows, Sally, you know it. And we grew up with that story. It's called The Tale of the Sands. And it's a story that was told to us endlessly as kids. And it's a story, along with many others, that are part of us. And what I want to say about stories and storytelling, to me and to us, some of us, I think all of us, it's a total obvious thing. These stories that we tell and we retell, they're far more than entertainments. They are far more even than a magical alchemy. They are part of us. And in a way, they are us. We are the stories that we tell and the stories that have been told to us. And there's a wonderful story that many of you may know called the story of Mushkil Shah, and which is often told on a Thursday night. I'm not going to tell it, don't worry. And there's a point in Mushkil Shah that I love. The old woodcutter is having a very bad day. And a lot of bad things have happened to him. And he's like really sick of whatever's happened. So he sits down and he decides to tell himself the version of his day, his story so far. And in my life, I lived this strange life, living in this strange, formerly haunted with jinns, if you believe it, mansion in Casablanca. And often I sit down on the sofa when I'm having a very bad day, just like Mushkil Shah, and I think, Tahir Shah, let's sit you down and tell yourself the story of what you've gone through, poor little lamb. And I'm like, you poor little thing. And I'm like, yeah, I am, but a horrid time. And the fact, this is kind of a serious point though. The fact that I tell myself the story of what has happened to me in the privacy of my own little room or office, this way of telling a story to myself, just like in Mushkil Kashab, which I learned it from, has a healing mechanism on me. And it sounds nuts, but it's something that I hope we'll talk about in a moment with Sally and Jason. But I think what we've all learned, and we all know, even though some of us don't recognize it or discuss it, stories have this machinery. They're a matrix. Like I said, our father used to say they were an instruction manual to the world. The way I've learned to appreciate stories is that they can enable us in actually a complex psychological way, and we'll discuss it. They can enable us to view our position, our relationships, our course, just like the little stream going down the mountain. They can enable us to think and rethink the various pieces of our lives and other people's lives. And they can enable us to triumph in times when we would otherwise be beaten. There's something that we've been brought up with, and it's this idea that, as I say, stories are far more than entertainments. Our dad, Idris Shah, the writer and thinker, would always say to us, a story is kind of like a peach. It's like a piece of fruit. It's told and retold and told again because it has this delicious flesh that people bite into and they just think it's the most yummiest thing ever. And they can't quite get enough of this taste and the texture. But the thing of real value in the story isn't the entertainment at all. It's not the flesh of the peach. It is the stone at the heart of that piece of fruit. the stone at the heart usually gets thrown into the garbage, but it ultimately finds its way and, is planted by the winds of time of fate. But the thing of value is the stone. The thing we all regard as the only thing of importance about the peach is the flesh, and the flesh is the entertainment, although it has its own role to play. There's something I think of often, and it's the way, as our dad used to go on, that these stories, there are different kinds of stories. There are stories that are only entertainments, for sure, but there are stories that are these complex psychological and anthropological documents in their own right. But in the Occidental world, in the West, what happens to hit me day in, day out while I live in Morocco is I see that here people will tell a story to give an example. They'll tell a story about the wise fool of Oriental folklore, Johar, the character that we grew up knowing in his Afghan identity, Nasruddin, Mullah Nasruddin. But often in the Occidental world, people forget that particular stories were created by geniuses in, throughout the twists and turns of humanity to pass on extraordinarily complicated ideas for society and humanity. This is the Noah's Ark that can save humanity in a way. And it's a Noah's Ark of folklore that has been passed on in such a genius way, so brilliantly. Most of the time we forget that it is what it is. It's rather like this. Imagine if there was a kingdom far away where there were no board games and no games at all. Imagine a place where there were farms and cities and villages and kinds of people, but there were no games because the king didn't like games because he couldn't win them. And so you can imagine this in so many countries or places even now. So the games were made null and void and illegal. You couldn't play games. And this kingdom, I'll call it the kingdom of Zog. I'm making this up. The kingdom of Zog, where the king decreed that games would be illegal. It was cut off from the outside world. Time passed and it was still cut off from the outside world. And after a long time, a farmer, so when the games were decreed null and void and illegal, sometimes people buried their games because they had games, but centuries passed. And one day a farmer was digging his field and he struck a big metal chest and he dug it up. He was all excited and he thought there was treasure inside. And he opened it up. And imagine this, in the chest, there was a very, very beautiful golden board with silver squares and gold squares. There were 8 this way and 8 that way, and there were these strange figurines. And he thought, this is just a lovely thing. Maybe it's something that people used to worship or whatever. And just when he had dug it up, imagine that soldiers in the royal palace saw him and they dragged him and the treasure chest and objects to the palace. And he was thrown in front of the king, who was the descendant of the king who had forbidden games to exist. And imagine that the king took possession of this object and dignitaries would be brought in from all corners of the kingdom to discuss the beauty of this object. But then one day, a visiting prince from a far-off kingdom did come to this kingdom of Zog, and he said to the king, well, should we play? And the king, Zog, of the kingdom of Zog, distant ancestor of the king who had forbidden games, said, "Are you deliberately trying to insult me? What do you mean play?" And the prince from the far off kingdom said, "This is the game of chess." My point with this, which I've sort of just made up, is that this is a very beautiful object. It's a very beautiful thing. It's a chessboard with pieces, and we can admire it, just like we can admire a story, the craftsmanship, the eloquence of it. But we can also use it as a tool. It's a didactic, amazing tool that can change our mental state and change the way we think and perceive the world. We could play chess with a chessboard, but we could admire it too. And what we've been brought up to do, my sister Safia and me and others, our other sister and others, we've been brought up to appreciate stories, but to allow them to work on us. When I was a kid, my dad once said to me, "These stories work in this magical way." And I remember saying to him, "Baba, but I don't know how to understand them." And he said, "Calm down. That is the real magic of folklore, of stories, of teaching stories in particular. You listen to them, particularly in oral form." And that's why, for me, the World Story Festival and Cafe is so important, because these are oral tellings. It's much more important when a story goes through your ears. I think, although I'm a writer, this is important. We don't need to understand how it works, just like we don't need to understand how the proteins in a plate of food break down and nourish us. But we need to believe in them. And through stories like, for example, and this is something that is so important to us, stories that maybe have a beginning, middle, and end, but are not necessarily the type of stories that we've grown to appreciate through, for example, Disney. Disney, although here I have a lamp of Disney, Aladdin. Aladdin is part of Alf Layla wa Layla, the 1001 Nights, the Arabian Nights, the greatest treasury of stories ever created in the history of humanity. Rather than, and I'm not knocking these new modern renditions of stories, but I think it's incredibly important to remember, a little bit like the stream coming down the mountainside in the Tale of the Sands. It's important to remember another time when stories didn't always have a clear and beautiful payoff at the end, or didn't always have an arc that could be told in the 2-hour version of a movie. But a story, 1001 Nights, it's up to 7,000 pages or longer, depending on, or shorter, it doesn't really matter the length. What's important is that a story challenges your ability to think in different ways, and that it leaves you kind of befuddled. There's an example. Here's an example. The medieval wise fool of Oriental folklore, who I mentioned, Johar. I can call him in Morocco Johar. If I call him Nasruddin, if there were any Afghans here, they'd say Mullah Nasruddin. I've been to Afghanistan, and you say Johar, and they're like, who the hell's that? But they tell exactly the same stories in Afghanistan and Marrakesh about the same character. You can go to Albania, Greece, you can go to Turkey, Iran, Iraq, so many countries, and they tell the stories of this character. He goes by all kinds of names, just like the stories themselves. It doesn't matter who he's called or what he's called, but what matters is the psychology of this mechanism. My very favorite Nasruddin story, and I'm just going to end with this, because in the same way that our father would tell us, it's good manners to begin with a story. He said it's good manners to end with a story. And then I'm going to bring on my two special guests. It's this. Nasruddin Mullah Nasruddin had the most demonic, horrendous, awful mother-in-law in the world. And but he was always trying to impress her because he knew if he could impress her just once, she might like him. And she was supposedly a good cook, although she was always trying to poison him when he came over to her house. So the mother-in-law was coming over. She announced she would be coming over, and Nasruddin, you better prepare a meal that is fit for your mother-in-law. And he thought, well, I don't even know what to cook, but I don't even have a pot big enough for her ego, let alone the ingredients to fit it. Then he remembered, well, my neighbor has a pot. And he thought, I'll go and ask my neighbor for the pot. But then he remembered that the neighbor was the greediest, nastiest person, even greedier and nastier and more egotistical than his mother-in-law. But summoning all his courage, he went over to the neighbor's house and he knocked at the door and he said, dear neighbor, my mother-in-law's coming. You know what they're like, the mother-in-laws. With huge ego, and I don't have a pot big enough to serve a meal fine enough for her. Could I please borrow your big pot? And the neighbor, this actually sounds so Moroccan because I can imagine it in Casablanca or Marrakesh. And the neighbor said, of course not. I'm going to lend you my pot. It's my pot. And how do I know it'll be clean? How do I know you'll take care of it? How do I know it won't be dented? Nasruddin said, look, just believe in me this one time. So after a lot of pleading and begging, Nasruddin went home with the neighbor's pot, allowed to use it for one night only. He cooked the most sublime meal that he had ever cooked. The mother-in-law was like, well, this is not so bad. She even had seconds, and she was nervous that he was now trying to poison her, but that she didn't drop dead. She was quite impressed. And the next morning, Nasruddin returned the pot, spick and span, so clean, to his neighbor's house. And the neighbor inspected the pot and said, all right, you did as you said, just this once. And Nasruddin said, oh, I forgot to tell you, just before I go, I really, really want to stay happy. What? Maybe because my mother-in-law was in the house. After I had used your pot and cleaned it, your pot, your big, beautiful cooking pot, it gave birth to another pot, a little lovely pot, just a little one. And because it's big pot's yours, I guess I've got to give you the little pot. The neighbor was thrilled. He was like, whoa, this is fabulous. So the next time the mother-in-law dropped by and Nasruddin borrowed the pot, the neighbor was all too happy to lend his big pot again because he thought maybe there'll be more progeny. Pot progeny. And the day after the pot had been borrowed for the second time, Nasruddin didn't return the big pot. And the neighbor came over to Nasruddin's house, knocked at the door and said, oh, I've come to get my big pot. And by the way, any little pots that it gave birth to tonight. And Nasruddin looked grave and he said, we cooked a great dinner. It was fabulous. I washed the pot, but then at 10 minutes past 12 last night, something very awful happened. And the neighbor said, what? Nasruddin said, well, we have established, have we not, that pots can be born, live full lives, and then die. And Nasruddin said, at 10 minutes past 12 last night, I regret to inform you your pot dropped dead. So that is Nasruddin and the pot. I'd like, we've still got a bit of time, I'd like to invite Jason, who's here, as my first special guest. Jason and I, Jason, come on. This is Jason Webster. Jason is a writer, like me. Jason, you're famous. You're on TV. Right. This is great. Jason is a writer, and he's been a friend of mine for a long, long time. He's written a lot of books on Spain, particularly the Arab connections with Moorish Spain. And in recent years, Jason and I have established a foundation, which is named after the greatest storyteller in storytelling history, factual or fantastic, Shahrazad, Queen Shahrazad, and it's called Shahrazad Foundation. And we wanted to talk about, explain what we're trying to do with folklore and stories and Shahrazad Foundation.
Yeah,
Maybe you can kind of explain what we're trying to do.
sure. Okay, so I mean, it's about 4 or 5 years ago, Tahir got in touch and said, look, I'm setting up this foundation. We're going to call it the Shahrazad Foundation. Do you want to get on board? And I thought, absolutely fantastic, because Shahrazad is a heroine of mine, and just the 1001 Nights are so incredible. And I think the thing about Shahrazad, right, is that story, the frame story of 1001 Nights, is so amazing because of how she eventually cures.
Can you
Shahrazad-
explain how the frame story?
Yeah,
Some people
yeah,
may
okay,
not even know.
okay, quick refresher on 1001 Nights. So there's a king called Shahryar, and he has, well, he's found his wife's been unfaithful to him, and he gets a little bit upset about this, and he has a head chopped off, and sort of thousands of other people.
He kind of has a mental health
He
crisis.
has a bit of a mental
What
health
you'd have
crisis.
for.
Yeah, with serious consequences with the people around him. And so what happens is he says, okay, well, I'm going to have a woman every night. A woman's going to come into my bedroom and we'll do what men and women do.
But
And
we'll
then
be married first.
we're married first, but for one night. And then, when dawn comes, when the sun rises in the morning, off with her head, because I don't trust any women, ever again, right? So that's it. So he's sort of working his way through all the young ladies of his kingdom, and they're getting a bit thin on the ground. And his main vizier, has a beautiful young daughter called Scheherazade, and she's very, very clever. And she goes up to her father, the vizier, and says, "Father, tonight it's my turn." And the vizier goes, "No, you're my daughter." But no, father, I know what to do. So she goes in and she refuses to go to bed with Shahryar. She said, "No, I'm going to tell you a story instead." And Shahryar. So she starts telling a story. And when the sun is rising in the morning, the story still hasn't ended. She leaves it on a cliffhanger. And Shahryar says, "Well, you're meant to have your head chopped off now, but I can't do this. I need to know how the story ends." And so he said, "Okay, I'll pardon you just this one night. You've got to come back tomorrow night and carry on the story." And she says, "Yeah, sure enough." So she comes back the next night and she carries on that story and starts another story, and then leaves it on a cliffhanger again, and dawn comes, and the same thing goes on and on for 1001 nights. There are stories within stories, and it's an absolutely wonderful sort of labyrinth of stories and tales. And by the end of it, this is what's so incredible about it. By the end of it, Shahryar, he's cured. He's cured by having heard all the stories, and he's sort of got over his mental health breakdown. And by doing so, and he said, "Right, now I'm going to marry you," and everybody lives happily ever after. So what's really interesting is how Scheherazade not only saves herself, but she saves the lives, thousands of women who would have come in her wake had she not done this, had she not told these stories and cured
And
Shahryar.
doing it in a kind of inside out, what our father would have called an oriental way. She didn't just go up to him and say, "Look, you're a stupid king who's a bit more than a bit naughty. You've got clear mental health issues." But she did it in a very kind of inside out organic way. And so with Shahrazad Foundation, what we've tried to do is everything that we do, and we do various projects and initiatives, we try to do them with the mindset of Shahrazad, Queen Shahrazad, which is never in a straight line. And that, my friend, is something I love about even being here in Marrakesh. Getting here to the World Storytelling Cafe.
It's not.
God help us. This is Zigzag Central. I always go on about Zigzag. Getting here, but you see the society. This is a society that tells stories.
Yeah.
The society here is inside out and back to front,
Right.
and no straight lines in Marrakesh.
It's almost like a story in itself, right? Just the way it sort of zigzags, and it's like a physical representation.
Can you explain about World Story Bank?
Yeah. So one of the initiatives that we launched this in September, back in September in London, and it's very, very much inspired by the idea of Scheherazade and the 1001. So it's called the World Story Bank, And like the 1001 Nights did for centuries, it kind of collected and reseeded some really crucially important stories back into society in multiple countries, in all of the Middle East and beyond, through translations into French, and German. So what we want to do is to collect stories which are actually in danger of dying out. So here's the thing. We've done some research on this. There is actually a threat at the moment. There does seem to be quite a clear threat to a lot of folk tales and a lot of stories, traditional stories around the world. And this is why there's a need for something like the World Story Bank. As the name implies, it's kind of inspired by seed banks and that idea, but I'll go into that in a minute. But so the threat, and we see this as a clear threat, comes from a number of factors and unique factors, I think, in today's world, which is, we've got globalization, we've got urbanization, massive urbanization. Stories generally come from the rural communities. We've got the rise of, digital world, living in an increasingly digital world, AI, all this kind of thing. So there's a multiple kind of cocktail of threats to traditional tales. And you see this in, for example, in the number of languages that go extinct, right? We are living through a great period of extinction in terms of language. So since the year 2000, about 90 languages have gone extinct, which is, a huge number. And with every language that goes extinct, that's a culture that just dies out. And with that culture, there's all kinds of things, but stories, traditional stories are one of the victims of that. And so it's quite hard to measure this, but we've done some research, we commissioned some research, and we think about every year, about 500 stories, traditional stories, are being wiped out. They're just lost. So that's part of the need for something like the World Story Bank. So if the way that the ecology movement has just taken off in the past decades, this idea that we're losing something, we're losing the diversity of plants and wildlife. We're thinking around that we need to kind of raise awareness on the global level about the threat to what we call mythodiversity. So taking the mythos in the wider sense of stories and legends and tales. And so mythodiversity, what we would like is in the next few years, people to be talking about mythodiversity as much as they talk about biodiversity. This is hugely important for humanity and we need to protect it. So World Story Bank is an initiative to try and address this issue. It's about collecting stories, but it's also a huge part of it is about rewilding stories back into societies around the world. Just as seed banks, the idea is you collect the seeds, but then you can actually start sowing them and rewilding plants that are in danger of dying out. So that's what, yeah.
And thank you. And I mean, what I wanted to say is what we're incredibly interested in at Sherazad Foundation is the way stories work. And although I said a moment ago that my dad said to me, it doesn't really matter if you understand it or not, we actually feel it is incredibly helpful to know how stories work, particularly because now we can do, advanced research on psychology and brainwaves and EEGs and that sort of thing. So I wanted to invite my second fabulous guest, Sally Mallam. Here, you center stage for Sally.
Right.
And I wanted to explain who Sally is. So, gosh, Sally has known my sister Safia, who's sitting over there, and me all our lives, or before our lives.
Bob.
Sally brought me back, apparently, so I understand, from the hospital. It was the 1960s, my darlings, and my parents went to collect twin number one, my sister, but they left twin number two, the little one, me, in the hospital.
And you were blue and small.
I was small and blue.
Incubated.
But now we fast forward many years. Sally's late husband was world renowned as a psychologist, Professor Robert Ornstein, living in Palo Alto, Los Altos, California. And since the 1960s, he began work, as I'm hoping you can try to explain to us, on the psychology of storytelling and stories and why it's useful and what it does for us. Can you dive in?
Yes, back in the 60s, there were not the massive amount of fMRI and all those instruments they have right now, but he did use EEGs and put these little, and he tested informational text as opposed to folk tales. And there are two hemispheres in the brain, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. The left hemisphere is all about logic and linear thinking, and the right hemisphere is more intuitive or storytelling, basically. And he did find there is a much greater activation in the right hemisphere. And then, because of his association with your father, he began to think of the stories that your father had as highly contextual. And because they're so highly contextual, he began to think, well, what did that mean in terms of what the potential is in the right hemisphere? And he worked a long time, or basically a long time sitting around thinking, actually, and reading, and eventually before his death, there was a lot more information out there, a lot more instruments to analyze what's going on in your brain. And that has been, and the studies do show that potentially the right hemisphere, it's like if you have, it's a continuum. If you have a small insight on solving a problem, like you can't solve, and then suddenly, bing, it goes, aha, got it. That's a certain activation in the brain that there's something called the default mode center, which is the part of the way you self-talk, that goes quiet. The frontal lobes go quiet. And suddenly you're in a space that some stories do take you to, where it's timeless, it's spaceless, it's magic does it, magical stories. There's genies popping in. And that space in and of itself is where we potentially need to grow. So it's within storytellers, stories that do that.
You know, I remember when we were kids, I was terrible at school and I would panic before exams. And I remember one night when I was about 10, the night before the exam, my dad sat me down. Actually, he got me to lie down on his uncomfortable blue sofa in his office. And he told me Nasruddin stories, Mullah Nasruddin stories. And the next day, I actually, for once, did quite well in the exam because they were working away. It was like this massaging thing. And they were uncomfortable in a way. It's a bit like Nasruddin in the Pot, the story that I told you, that they weren't the Disney with the payoff at the end, and uncomfortable.
Because it's the right hemisphere. In that continuum, it's wordless. It's space. It's a different consciousness that goes parallel. So the crazy things happen, you think, well, that's lucky, that's that activation.
Do you think only humans tell stories? Do you think?
Yes.
Do they? I mean, I don't know.
I think because I think it started when we stood upright. Well, it was Australopithecus that stood upright first, but once we got to Homo erectus, which is like 500,000 years ago, the pelvis, the brain got bigger because with hands we were cooking. Erectus was cooking food. So there was a problem. Your brain, your head is getting bigger, and your pelvis, because you're upright, is getting smaller. So evolution, those who survive, are us because we're born immature. So our brains are very small. And because we're born immature with only 25% of our brain mature, that's the 75% that has to grow in the world, and because it grows in the world, there has to be a narrative of how this happened.
Okay.
Then you get stories.
So interesting. Okay, exactly. And the fact that I just told you that it's a bit like Mushkil Gusha, I'm telling my own story to myself in my head. Again, the fact that I just told you that when I was a kid, my father told me Nasruddin stories before exams. I told you that as a story.
Yes.
often when I'm on a bus, London bus, on the top deck or something, I'll listen to people telling each other what happened, particularly women. And I noticed that women, and this is why we're interested with Sherazade, with women. Women, I think, are much better storytellers than men. Sorry, but I think they tell stories in a much easier way, and they often recount things, narratives that have happened during the day within a story framework. Can you comment on that?
Well, I forget his name, but one guy did look into gossip, and apparently 60 to 85% of our conversations are gossip. And this one guy assumed that it was a way in which early man, Paleolithic man, learned the do's and don'ts. It's just, you can't do this. Look at what he did, because one of the most important things for us, because we were born immature, we had to rely on our mother, and our mother had to rely on the group. It wasn't, so group became the most important thing. Once you have a group, you communicate. How do you communicate? You have to tell what happened and how it happened, and he didn't do the right thing, and it becomes
in a way
story.
that is
The do's and don'ts of society.
it's fun and interesting.
Yes.
I mean, what I noticed, and some of us who have had kids know that, or told storytellers watching this, or or anyone here, particularly with children, but not only. As soon as you get a group of children who are wriggling and jiggling, and you say, once upon a time, long, long ago, in a far off land, there was something happened.
Even that, there's
So what
a
is
guy
it
called
that
Kravitz who said, well, it's the same in your brain, as far as your brain knows. It's the same as when you go on a high mountain and you look over, suddenly you're not thinking about you. You're thinking, gosh, it's a wonderful universe. So it's that same distance that's created by once upon a time, long, long ago. It puts your right hemisphere into that space where you will be more intuitive, more in.
Pretty much every culture has its version of the phrase. So
My favorite, I think, is the Korean, and I may be wrong on this. So in French it says il était une fois, but I think in Korean, I read the other day, it says once upon a time when cats smoked pipes.
Yes.
Which is, I don't know, maybe unbc, but I love that.
When fish, what is it? Fish swam upside down.
Birds fly back to front.
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Your father's.
What do you think the future of storytelling is in the sort of digital age? And
Well, I think one thing that we need to do, which you've spoken about, is we need to somehow get kids who are stuck on social media to realize that that's promoting the more primitive side of their brain, that sort of give it to me, I need it, I'm happy, okay, where's the next bit for me? And that's why they're unhappy with it. And but it is addictive. The dopamine, it gets rush every time you see a light like that, the kids get high, and they spend a lot of time at that, but there's apparently boredom, boredom has gone up, and I think, well, I was to talk about this, one of the things about the boredom is we look for meaning, and that's where storytelling comes in. It's connection and it's meaning. And these kids don't have time to think about the meaning because there's so many distractions. Am I getting this instant reaction? Am I getting that instant reaction? I only got 2 likes, or I've been at it 4 hours or something. I don't know how it works because I don't do social media recently. But so I think what we can do is introduce stories. I mean, look at some of your dad's stories. They're only about 3 minutes.
Yeah.
If that. So you can say, take a break. Read the story. Already then you're doing something with their brains that's less than really monkey land. In normal consciousness.
More optimistic
yeah,
viewing. I do a lot of storytelling in places that don't have storytelling shows and music festivals and so forth, and county shows. And 20 years ago, before digital media, and there were only 5 television channels.
Yeah.
The children were touching and just receiving.
Yes, exactly.
Now with the digital media, there's a lot of interaction. So, and when I'd be going around trying to persuade people to listen to a story, or what storytelling? Well, never heard of that. Now, there's no question, because you're just one more button to press. But if you're a storyteller, tell me a story. And it's so the audience is broadening, provided we allow ourselves
We've
to
got
be.
to find ways of getting in this. Because it's also, kids like things that stories offer. They like not knowing what's going to happen next. Stories do that.
Well, something I love about oral storytelling, and I didn't always see it in Jamarfna, the main square here, when there's a halka and a storyteller, he or she are monitoring, and a good storyteller does this, monitoring the audience to double check. Do they need a fight scene? And I know from Jamarfna, because I've spent a lot of time there kind of taking it in over the years. As soon as the audience starts to thin out, people have a crash, bang, whatever, and then there was a fight. And then everyone comes back with a fight. And sometimes you'll see in Jamarfna two storytellers. One has a fight scene and the other one starts with a bigger fight scene, and everyone gravitates to them. And then, you know, it's this duel of the storytellers. But it's something that maybe not social media, but digital storytelling can do in the future, which is to create, and maybe AI, maybe that's, you know, the course for AI is to create the new trajectory of a story, depending on, I suppose that's what video games
You
do.
know, I often thought about, say, for example, the story of the magic horse.
Yeah,
I mean, Gumball chooses the magic horse and the other guy chooses the fish, right? But if you could do it as an interactive video, right?
Yeah.
And you take it to where the two brothers are deciding what they want to represent, or the king decides where the kids can actually choose. I want to choose the magic. I want to choose the fish, and where that takes them.
and
You know, so you
I
can
mean,
do it as a game.
exactly, my
see
sense
what-
is, although, gosh, in many ways, even collections like the 1001 Nights, the written down versions came centuries after the oral tellings have been, you know, in circulation for centuries. So AI is just the new incarnation. And Disney, of course, I'm not knocking it, you know, with Aladdin and the others.
But that Disney does
Well,
addict you to the
I know,
the
exactly.
emotional
And
stuff,
in a way,
rather
there's
than-
nothing, I mean, in a way, to me, what I love is, I love stories and storytelling. I love that more than anything. And I want to maybe leave with this idea that one of the reasons I wanted to live here and I wanted to move to Morocco was that my kids were tiny and I wanted them to grow up in a place where fact and fantasy was blurred. And my kids grew up at Dar Khalifa, this wonderful house where I live in Casablanca. And they were brought up in the kitchen by Zina, the housekeeper. And she would always be feeding them lunch with a spoon, and their mouths were open because they were lazy and she was controlling. And she would always be feeding them and telling a story as she went. And as soon as they stopped eating, she stopped with the story. This is how stories have been passed on in Morocco and everywhere else since the beginning of time, particularly in the home and particularly in this micro way. And the story changed. You know, when the kids were getting bored or whatever, she'd have a fight scene, just like, and not a lot. Well, my daughter Ariane always wanted a love scene. Tim always like fight scenes, you know, not another love scene. And I thought that was interesting because she had to please both of them. It's like there's a very famous film called The Princess Bride, and I was reading about it the other day, and it's one of my favorite films. When the writer, I think it's Golding, he was asked to write a film, and he said to his kids, "What should I do?" And his son said, "Oh no, maybe it was two daughters, I don't know." But one kid said a bride, write about a bride. The other one said a princess. So he wrote The Princess Bride. That is the wonderful thing about stories. that we can make them whatever they need to be.
And I
for-
think those,
Right?
the key storytellers knew exactly what they were doing. Because they made the stories in a way that, I mean, I often thought about your father's work. It's like we're all a bit of a rough ruby, you know. And so you get this ruby, and your dad knew society well enough to decide to say to himself, well, in order to get this right hemisphere activation, in order to
Right.
get us to be more consciously evolved,
Right.
which I can go into at length, but you have this collection of stories. So one story works, it smooths that out, one story moves that out.
Exactly.
And finally you get a ruby.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
actually, he gave me a bunch of rough rubies. That's where I got the story from. So, I
Right.
think that's, so those stories do, the corpus that he left us with actually make. And you
And
end
you
up with a
remember,
ruby,
I mean,
a real ruby. I mean,
you remember how obsessed he was with getting people to, you know, tell and retell stories, but to weave them into their lives.
Yes.
And that's why I'm loving, you know, the storytelling festival and storytelling cafe here, because it does just that. And I mean, it's wonderful to me to see storytellers brought together in one place, John, because quite often in my life, I meet storytellers, but not all kind of brought together. And I think there's this transmission between them of, you know, of magic. Anyway.
And then they've done studies just recently. I read a study last night by Germans, who are pretty good at this, on magic. And they worked with Harry Potter.
Yeah.
And they tested with fMRI, that scans, and they tested what happens when it's just normal activity and what happens when it's magic, and off it goes.
And there's,
Right
in a way,
hemisphere
there's no
and love.
surprise about that,
No,
right?
that's the thing. Once you understand that, the science, you have to wait for the science to come in. Because it's obvious, and you see it's coming in now, because neuroscientists are very excited. So you read something about, oh, empathy, and they say, oh, empathy, that's the right hemisphere, and that is important, and that only happens when there's this default mode that is me. What are you going to think of me after I've stopped talking? When that goes away, and you can tell the Nazarene story of the king. What was the king?
What? The king?
Yeah.
Well, you tell it.
No, well, Nasruddin came back to his village, and he'd been to see and he'd seen the king. So they're all very excited. Been to see the king, to see what he said. Listen, so they're very, very excited. So Nasruddin said, well, I saw the king, and it was amazing, and so exciting. And finally, and everybody gets bored because he's going on and on about how amazing it was. And finally, this guy said, well, what did he actually say? He said, get out of my way.
Get out of my way, you fool. I know.
You know, so that's it. We have to, in order to get this activation going, in order to be who we are potentially, we have to get away from the selflessness. Bob used to say that the greatest step for the next, the important step for humanity now is to realize the selfishness, that the most selfish act you can have is to be selfless.
Oh,
It's
okay.
only going to work. This being on this earth is going to work if we're selfless, and stories can help run it there. Really.
Thank you.
Thanks to our fabulous trio who took us with magic, took us not just back through their generations, but generations before, and generations before that, and generations before that, and manifesting. It is magic because we're just sitting there now, and we've just travelled back through time. So,
Well, thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you all.
Okay.
so where else will people have the opportunity of seeing you during?
I think
this festival?
tomorrow I'm speaking, which is Tuesday, I'm speaking with my sister Safia, and
I'm going to wear the badge tomorrow.
okay, so
I really would like to hear you speaking.
and we're in conversation with Richard Hamilton from the BBC, talking about partly about our father Tahir Shah, a strange and magical childhood. I know plenty about it.
Yeah.
But thank you. Could you take a picture of us?
Yeah.
With John? Yeah,
That's good.
just, with John, we have John.
That way.
Okay. Yeah, this is oh.
Okay.
Nice.
Okay.
You can take with John as well. Oh, he was, that was,
Yeah, yeah.
sorry. I was seeing the camera behind. Yeah.
No,
You're interested.
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you, Waleed. Waleed flies the magic carpet
Yeah.
for us.
You got to like to
Great one.